My son called me worthless in the beautiful $3.5 million house I bought for him. I just smiled and nodded. The next day, a certified letter arrived for him at his office. It was an eviction notice. Before I dive into this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who severely underestimated your worth. It was exactly 1 a.m. when the first domino fell. I know the time because I remember glancing at the glowing red numbers on my bedside clock just before I tossed the heavy duvet aside. At 70 years old, sleep does not come as easily as it used to. Sometimes it is the ache in my joints from decades of hard labor, and sometimes it is simply the quiet of the night pressing down on me. On this particular night, it was just a dry throat. I needed a glass of water. I slipped out of bed, my feet finding the plush carpet of the guest bedroom. They always called it the guest bedroom, even though I had been living there for the better part of a year. I stepped out into the expansive hallway of the Bellevue mansion. The house was usually tomb-silent at this hour, a sprawling fortress of glass and steel nestled among the pines. But as I padded softly toward the sweeping grand staircase, a low murmur of voices drifted up from the lower level. At first I thought someone had left the television on in the media room. Derek, my 38-year-old son, was a self-proclaimed tech CEO who often stayed up late pacing the floors and claiming to be working on his next big pitch. I gripped the smooth oak handrail and began my descent, intending to simply tell him good night and grab my water from the kitchen. But as I reached the landing, the voices grew sharper, more distinct. It was not the television. It was Derek and his wife Morgan. I paused in the deep shadows of the lower hallway, standing just out of sight, near the massive arched entryway that led into their pristine open-concept kitchen. The lights were dimmed, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. Morgan was leaning against the central island, swirling a glass of white wine. Even at 1 a.m, she was wearing a silk robe that cost more than my first car. But I could hear the bitter edge in her voice before I could fully make out the words. She was pacing slightly, her bare feet slapping against the stone floor. She sounded exasperated, her voice a tight, high-pitched hiss. She was talking about me. She complained that my presence in the house was suffocating her. She whined that my old leather recliner, the one piece of furniture I had asked to bring with me when I moved in, was completely destroying the modern minimalist aesthetic she had spent months curating for her social media followers. She said I was always hovering around like a ghost, that my very existence in their home was an absolute burden. She actually used the word eyesore. She said I was an eyesore in her perfect house. I stood there in the dark, my hand frozen mid-air, feeling a strange numbness wash over me. You expect a certain level of friction when multiple generations live under one roof. You expect minor annoyances. But the pure, unadulterated disgust dripping from my daughter-in-law's voice felt like a physical blow. I waited for my son to speak up. I waited for Derek, the boy I had raised, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and whose college tuition I had worked 80-hour weeks to pay to defend his father. I waited for him to remind his wife that I had sacrificed everything for his success. Instead, I heard the heavy sigh of a man who completely agreed. Derek was sitting at the kitchen table rubbing his temples. When he finally spoke, his voice was so cold, so utterly devoid of any warmth or familial affection, that it chilled me to the bone. He told her to just lower her voice so the old man would not wake up. Then he looked at his wife and said words that will remain burned into my memory for the rest of my life. He said the old man just eats and takes up space. He is completely worthless around here. He does not help with anything. Believe me, Morgan, if I did not need his monthly pension checks to pad Leo's private school fund, I would have dumped him in a cheap nursing home months ago. I stopped breathing. The air in my lungs turned to lead. Worthless. Takes up space. Dumped in a nursing home. I did not gasp. I did not step out from the shadows and demand an explanation. At 70 years of age, you learn that reacting in anger only gives your enemy the advantage. Instead, I looked down at my bare feet. I was standing on imported custom-cut Italian marble. It was cool and smooth against my skin. I remembered the exact day that marble was installed. I remembered it because I was the one who wrote the check for it. In fact, I was the one who wrote the check for the entire house. $3.5 million paid in full straight from my accounts. They were standing as a kitchen that my blood, sweat, and tears had paid for. They were drinking wine bought with the wealth I had generated. My son was casually talking about me being a useless freeloader, completely and conveniently forgetting that the roof over his head, the walls protecting his family, and the very ground he was walking on belonged to me. I was not a clueless old man who had stumbled into their successful lives. I was the founder of a massive supply chain logistics company in Seattle. I had spent 40 years negotiating with cutthroat union bosses, outsmarting vicious corporate rivals, and building a highly profitable empire from absolutely nothing. I had navigated economic crashes and ruthless competitors. You do not survive in the world of freight and logistics by being soft, and you certainly do not build a multi-million-dollar fortune by being stupid. Yet here was my son, a boy who liked to play pretend, as a tech mogul treating me like a stray dog he had generously taken in out of the rain. He genuinely believed he held all the power. He genuinely believed I was just a fading old relic, too tired and too naive to understand what was happening around me. The sheer audacity of it was almost poetic. It was so remarkably arrogant that it bypassed my anger and tapped directly into a deeply buried ice-cold part of my brain, the part of me that used to dismantle rival companies piece by piece. I looked at the water glass resting on the console table next to me. I did not need a drink anymore. My thirst was gone, replaced by a sudden razor-sharp clarity. I did not make a sound. I simply smiled. It was not a smile of joy, but the kind of dark, quiet smile a predator makes when the prey willingly walks directly into a steel trap. Before I reached the stairs, I took a moment to just listen to the house. The low hum of the central climate control, the faint hum of the luxury appliances in the kitchen, the absolute perfect temperature of the air. It was a house designed to filter out the noise of the real world. When my wife Patricia died 2 years ago from cancer, this house was supposed to be a sanctuary. Derek had begged me to buy it, promising that we would all live together, that I would never be lonely, that we would be a true family. I had sold the massive estate Patricia and I shared, liquidated a portion of my portfolio, and handed them this pristine life on a silver platter. I did it because a father wants to protect his son. I did it because I was grieving and wanted to keep the remaining pieces of my family close. And this was my reward. Being called an eyesore. Being called a worthless freeloader by a man who had not earned a single brick of the foundation he was standing on. I continued my silent retreat up the stairs. Every step I took felt lighter than the last. For the past year, I had walked around this house with a heavy heart, constantly tiptoeing around Morgan's moods and Derek's supposed stress, trying my best not to be an inconvenience. I had shrunk myself down to fit into their perfectly curated lives. I had spoken softly, eaten quietly, and spent most of my days reading in my room just to avoid getting in their way. I was not going to tiptoe anymore. I was not going to shrink. The man who had spent 4 decades dominating the shipping lanes of the Pacific Northwest was finally waking up from a long, grief-induced slumber. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at the framed photograph of Patricia on my nightstand. She had always warned me about Derek's sense of entitlement. She used to say that we had shielded him from the harsh realities of the world for too long, that we had given him the fruit without ever teaching him how to plant the tree. I had always brushed off her concerns, insisting that he just needed more time to mature. As I looked into her printed eyes, I silently apologized to her. She had been right all along. But I reached over and turned off the small bedside lamp, plunging the room into total darkness. My son and daughter-in-law wanted me to be a clueless old man. I would give them exactly the performance they expected. But behind their backs, I was going to tear down the very walls I had built for them. The morning sunlight poured through the large windows of the Bellevue mansion, casting a deceptive glow over the Italian marble floors. It was 7. The air smelled of espresso and expensive lavender cleaner. If a stranger walked into this kitchen, they would see the absolute picture of upper-class domestic bliss. But after what I heard in the dark hours of the night, the pristine countertops and the perfectly arranged fruit bowls looked like a meticulously constructed stage set. I walked into the kitchen wearing my worn slippers and a thick cardigan. I made sure to stoop my shoulders slightly. I let my steps drag, playing the part of the tired, fading patriarch they believed me to be. Derek was sitting at the massive quartz island, typing frantically on his silver laptop. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, projecting the image of a busy tech visionary. Morgan was standing by the imported espresso machine dressed in flawless athletic wear, looking as though she was about to head to a private Pilates session. Neither of them looked like people who had just spent the night wishing I was locked away permanently. When they heard my slippers scuffing against the marble, their heads snapped up in unison. "Good morning, Dad," Derek said, his voice bright and artificially energetic. He did not look up from his screen for more than a second. "Sleep well." I pulled out one of the heavy oak bar stools and lowered myself onto it with a staged, labored sigh. "I slept all right, son. Just all right." The quiet in this big house gives a man too much time to think. Morgan turned around, holding a ceramic mug. She forced a bright smile that did not quite reach her cold eyes. "Thinking about what, Robert? Is the mattress in the guest room acting up again? I can call the interior designer and have a new one rushed over by tomorrow. We only want you to be comfortable." I looked at her, studying the tension in her jaw. "No, the mattress is fine, Morgan." I folded my hands on the cool quartz countertop and looked down at my knuckles. "I was just thinking about my place here, about how much space I take up. I know you two are young and busy. You are building an empire, Derek, and need more room. You have your social obligations, Morgan, and little Leo needs room to grow." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, ensuring they felt the weight of my next words. "I think it might be time for me to start looking into a retirement community. A nice, quiet place where I will not be in your way." The reaction was instantaneous and spectacular. If I had not spent 40 years negotiating hostile corporate takeovers, I might have missed the sheer naked panic that flashed across Derek's face. His hands froze over his laptop keyboard. The color drained from his pale cheeks. Leaving him looking sickly under the bright kitchen lights, Morgan practically dropped her ceramic mug on the counter. The coffee sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white surface, but she did not even notice. She rushed around the island and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was freezing cold. "Dad, do not be silly," Morgan said, her voice suddenly dripping with a syrupy, desperate sweetness. She squeezed my hand tightly, almost painfully. "You are not in our way. You are the pillar of this family. We love having you here. Leo adores having his grandfather down the hall. You cannot leave us. You are our foundation." I kept my expression mild, feigning a look of touching gratitude, while internally I was analyzing her sudden shift. Just 12 hours ago, I was an eyesore ruining her modern aesthetic. Now I was the pillar of the family. Derek slammed his laptop shut and stood up. He walked over and placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Dad, please. Do not ever say that again. This is your home. We want you here. If we have seemed a little distant or tense lately, please forgive us. It has absolutely nothing to do with you. It is just the business. It is the stress of the startup." I looked up at him, widening my eyes slightly to look innocent and concerned. "The business is something wrong with the company, Derek. You know you can always talk to me. I have navigated my fair share of corporate rough patches." Derek chuckled, a hollow, breathless sound. No. Nothing is wrong, Dad. It is actually the opposite. We are growing too fast. We are right in the middle of closing our Series B funding round. It is a massive deal. Millions of dollars on the table. But the venture capitalists are incredibly demanding. The legal paperwork, the due diligence, it is keeping me up at night. The problem is that all my personal capital, everything I have, is completely tied up in company equity right now. I am cash poor on paper until the funding clears next month. Morgan quickly stepped in to reinforce his lie. She nodded vigorously, her perfectly styled hair bobbing. Exactly, Robert. Derek is carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders right now. He is just stressed out and exhausted from working so hard. Sometimes we snap at each other because the pressure is so high. But we would never want you to leave. We need you here. Your presence grounds us. I listened to their rehearsed explanations, tracking the cadence of their words. It was a beautiful, plausible lie. A stressed tech founder, a supportive wife, a temporary cash flow problem caused by explosive business growth. It was exactly the kind of story a proud father would want to hear. It was designed to flatter my ego and appeal to my protective instincts. They wanted me to feel needed and important right now, to feel like the wise, benevolent patriarch who was graciously supporting his ambitious son through a tough transition. I reached out and patted Morgan's cold hand. Then I looked up at Derek and offered a warm, forgiving smile. I understand, son. Building a company from the ground up is the hardest thing a man can do. I remember the early days of my logistics firm. There were nights I thought I would lose my mind from the stress. I should not have taken your exhaustion personally. I will not mention the retirement home again. You have my absolute final word. Derek let out a massive, shuddering breath. It was a sigh of profound relief, the sound of a man who had just dodged a bullet. He squeezed my shoulder one more time. Thank you, Dad. You have no idea how much that means to me. We are going to get through this funding round, and then things will go back to normal, I promise. Morgan smiled brightly, the tension finally leaving her jaw. Let me make you some of that expensive artisanal tea you like, Robert. The chamomile and honey blend. You just sit there and try to completely relax. I will make us all a nice big breakfast. I sat at the quartz island, watching Morgan bustle around the kitchen with an exaggerated show of domestic joy. I watched Derek open his laptop again, his fingers hovering over the keys. I played the role of the relieved, comfortable grandfather to absolute perfection. I sipped the hot artisanal tea Morgan placed in front of me and praised its flavor. But behind my mild eyes and polite nods, my mind was operating with the cold precision of a supercomputer. I noticed the way Derek's hands were still trembling slightly as he typed. I noticed that his laptop screen, briefly visible in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator, showed a generic sports news website, not complex financial models or term sheets for a venture capital firm. I noticed the forced, almost frantic energy in Morgan's movements. They were terrified. The lie they had just spun was far too perfect, far too rehearsed. If Derek truly had a temporary cash flow problem due to a massive, successful funding round, he would not be whispering in the middle of the night about dumping me in a nursing home to access my monthly pension checks. A man on the verge of closing a multi-million-dollar deal does not need to steal an old man's Social Security deposits to survive. Their desperation was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. The story about the startup was a smokescreen. They were hiding something massive, something disastrous. Their panic was not about me leaving. Their panic was about the money leaving with me. I took another sip of the hot tea. I knew right then and there that I could not confront them directly today. I was going to pull this lie up by the roots. The rest of the day unfolded with a sickeningly sweet rhythm. Morgan brought me a plate of sliced fruit for lunch, and Derek actually paused his supposed frantic typing to ask how my afternoon reading was going. It was a flawless performance, a sudden burst of domestic devotion that would have brought a tear to the eye of any unsuspecting father. But I was not unsuspecting. I was a man who had spent 4 decades negotiating with union bosses who smiled to my face while trying to bleed my accounts dry. I knew exactly what a strategic charm offensive looked like. I spent the afternoon in my room mentally reviewing every financial arrangement I had made since moving into this house. I had handed over the down payment, sure, but I had also let them manage the daily expenses. I wanted Derek to feel like the man of the house. I had given him the illusion of control, and clearly that illusion had metastasized into a dangerous breed of entitlement. Evening arrived, draping the Bellevue mansion in cool, quiet shadows. After a quiet dinner where the conversation was painfully forced, I retreated to my room. I was sitting under the warm glow of my reading lamp when the soft knock came. "Come in," I called out, my voice appropriately thin. The heavy oak door swung open, and Derek stepped inside. He had changed out of his crisp work shirt and was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, looking every inch the devoted son. But what immediately caught my attention was the thick manila folder clutched tightly in his right hand. His knuckles were white. The casual, confident posture he usually carried himself with was gone, replaced by a rigid, almost vibrating tension. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice dropping into a low, soothing register. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all, Derek," I replied, placing my book on the side table. "What is on your mind?" He walked over and sat on the edge of the bed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It was a posture of intimacy. He sighed a heavy, theatrical exhalation. "I have been thinking a lot about our conversation this morning." He began, his eyes fixed on mine with practiced sincerity. "About what you said regarding feeling like a burden. It really broke my heart to hear you say that, Dad. You have given us this beautiful life, and I never want you to feel like you are anything less than the center of this family." I smiled gently, letting my shoulders slump a little more. "Thank you, son. That is very kind." He tapped the manila folder against his knee. "But it did make me realize that I have been dropping the ball on a few things. With the startup pulling me in 100 different directions and this Series B funding round eating up every waking hour, I have not been managing our long-term family planning as well as I should. I want to make sure that you are completely protected, Dad." He slid the folder open and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stapled neatly at the top corner. The paper was heavy, expensive stock. "What is all this?" I asked, squinting, playing the part of the confused elder perfectly. Derek offered a soft, reassuring smile. "It is just a standard precaution, Dad. A temporary medical and financial power of attorney." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Power of attorney. It was a phrase that carried the weight of absolute surrender. I kept my face blank. A precaution for what, Derek? He leaned closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a heavy burden. "Well, like I said this morning, the startup is taking all my time. The investors are breathing down my neck. God forbid, if you ever got sick or even just needed help managing your accounts, the banks are an absolute nightmare to deal with. If you were hospitalized or just too tired to handle the paperwork, they could freeze your accounts. I would not be able to pay your medical bills, and more importantly, I would not be able to access your pension to keep transferring the monthly payments into Leo's private school fund." He paused, letting the mention of his son settle between us. It was a calculated emotional strike. "I just want to streamline things, Dad," he continued smoothly. "This document just gives me the legal authority to bypass the bank's bureaucracy. It allows me to handle the transfers for Leo's tuition and manage any emergency expenses on your behalf without having to bother you with signatures and phone calls. It is just a safety net. You do not have to worry about a single thing. You can just relax and enjoy your retirement. I will carry the load for you." He held out a sleek, heavy silver pen, the tip pointed directly at me. The final page of the document was already marked with small, bright yellow sticky tabs indicating where my signature was required. It was a masterclass in manipulation. The plausible lie was beautifully constructed. He used his supposed business success as the excuse for his lack of time. He used my potential failing health as the looming threat. And he used my grandson's education as the emotional hostage. He was framing the absolute surrender of my financial independence as a favor, a loving gesture from a dutiful son to his tired father. I reached out with a slightly trembling hand and took the stack of papers. I did not take the silver pen. I reached into my cardigan pocket and slowly pulled out my reading glasses. "Let me just take a quick look, son." "You know I like to read things over," I murmured, slipping the glasses onto my face. Derek shifted uncomfortably on the bed. "Of course, Dad. But it is really just standard boilerplate language. Nothing to worry about." The lawyer said it is as basic as it gets. I flipped past the cover page and scanned the dense paragraphs of text. My eyes swept over the carefully structured clauses, the defined terms, the sweeping authorizations. It took me less than 30 seconds to realize exactly what I was holding. This was not standard boilerplate language. This was not a limited temporary safety net to pay a child's school tuition. This was a financial death warrant. The document granted the appointed agent sweeping irrevocable authority over all liquid assets, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and trust funds. It included clauses that explicitly allowed the agent to liquidate assets, alter beneficiary designations, and transfer funds into accounts wholly owned by the agent without any requirement for secondary approval or oversight. It even contained a deeply buried medical clause that gave the agent the unilateral power to commit the principal to an assisted living facility and make binding psychiatric care decisions. I recognized the aggressive, predatory phrasing immediately. I recognized it because it was the exact same type of corporate verbiage I used to employ in the late 90s when I was orchestrating hostile takeovers of rival supply chain companies. Back then, my lawyers and I would bury total surrender clauses inside mountains of seemingly benign legal jargon. We would smile, shake hands, and tell our targets that the contracts were just standard procedural formalities. By the time they realized they had signed away their entire companies, my team had already seized their assets and locked them out of their own buildings. I was holding a weapon designed to strip me of every ounce of power, dignity, and wealth I possessed. My own son had hired a shark of a lawyer to draft a document that would reduce me to a legal ghost in my own life. The sheer cruelty of it was breathtaking. I thought back to the conversation in the kitchen at 1 a.m. If I did not need his monthly pension checks to pad Leo's fund, I would have dumped him in a cheap nursing home months ago. Now, looking at the medical clauses in this document, I realized that his midnight rant had not been an idle threat. It was a preview of his actual legal strategy. He was going to take my money and then erase me. I felt a cold, hard knot form in the center of my chest. The betrayal was absolute, severing the last fragile threads of paternal leniency I had clung to. But I could not let him see that. I could not let the wolf know that the sheep was actually a lion. I let out a long, exhausted sigh. I pulled the reading glasses down to the tip of my nose and rubbed my eyes, making sure my hand shook just enough to look convincing. I looked up at Derek, letting my face fall into a mask of overwhelming confusion and elderly fatigue. "Goodness, Derek," I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy. "This legal jargon is just too much for my old eyes tonight. It is like reading a foreign language. Heretofore, henceforth, fiduciary responsibilities. It makes my head spin." Derek leaned forward, the silver pen still extended. The muscles in his jaw were ticking. "I know, Dad. Lawyers always complicate things. That is why I am telling you it is just a formality. You can just sign on the yellow tabs, and I will take care of the rest. You do not need to stress your eyes over this." I slowly closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it, shaking my head with a gentle, apologetic smile. "No, son. You know how your mother was. She always told me never to sign anything after 8 in the evening. The brain just does not process things right when it is tired. I appreciate you looking out for me, I really do. But I'm going to need a clear head to look this over. I will read it carefully over the weekend, and we can deal with it on Monday." Derek's mask slipped. It was just for a fraction of a second, but it was there. His eyes widened, and a flash of pure, unadulterated panic twisted his features. His hand holding the pen dropped slightly. He opened his mouth to argue, his voice rising in pitch. "But Dad, the lawyers need this filed by tomorrow afternoon. If we wait until Monday, the bank might delay the processing, and Leo's tuition payment is due on the 15th. We really should just get it out of the way right now." I maintained my mild, confused smile, but I hardened my tone just a fraction. Derek, the tuition is not due for another 2 weeks. A couple of days will not make a difference. I am just too exhausted tonight, son. My brain feels like mush. I will look at it on Saturday when I am fresh. That is my final word. I handed him back the silver pen. He stared at it for a moment, then slowly took it. He stood up from the bed, his entire body rigid with suppressed frustration. The loving, devoted son routine was cracking around the edges. He forced a tight, unnatural smile, his lips pulled thin across his teeth. Okay, Dad. Whatever makes you comfortable. Take the weekend. We will talk on Monday. He turned and walked out of the room, shutting the heavy oak door behind him with a sharp, echoing click. He did not say good night. I sat alone in the quiet of the guest room, the thick manila folder resting on my lap like a ticking bomb. The silence of the Bellevue mansion pressed in around me, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a battlefield. I picked up the folder and ran my thumb along the smooth edge of the expensive paper. Derek thought he was dealing with a tired, fading old man who could be easily confused by a few dense paragraphs of legal text. He thought his plausible lie about startup stress and banking bureaucracy was bulletproof. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He was wrong. Dead wrong. He had brought a contract to a corporate war. He had presented me with the exact blueprint of his intended betrayal. He wanted a hostile takeover of my life assets and future. He wanted to strip me down and discard me like broken machinery. I set the folder down on the nightstand right next to the photograph of Patricia. I did not feel sorrow anymore. The grief of losing my son to greed and entitlement had burned away, leaving only a cold, indestructible resolve. I was not going to be a victim in my own house. I was not going to be discarded. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I needed to move in the shadows. I needed to gather my ammunition. And when the time was right, I was going to tear his perfect artificial world apart, piece by piece. The following day stretched out with an agonizing slowness. I spent the morning confined to my room, listening to the heavy silence of the house. Derek had left early for his office, slamming the front door with the kind of aggressive energy he always used to signal his importance to the world. Morgan had departed shortly after announcing that she had a grueling day of wellness appointments and charity committee meetings. I was left alone, with my thoughts, the manila folder safely hidden beneath a false bottom in my suitcase. I sat in the quiet, wrestling with the burning realization that the son I had raised was actively plotting my financial ruin. By late afternoon, the sprawling mansion felt suffocating. I decided to head downstairs to make myself a cup of dark coffee and clear my mind. The golden afternoon light was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room, casting warm, beautiful shadows across the imported furniture. It was a house that demanded admiration, a monument to wealth and comfort. Yet as I walked toward the kitchen, the illusion of that comfort was instantly shattered. Sitting alone at the massive kitchen island, his small legs dangling far above the floor, was my 7-year-old grandson, Leo. The house was completely quiet, save for the faint crunching sound of his spoon hitting the sides of a ceramic bowl. I stopped in the archway, my brow furrowing in confusion. It was nearly 6 in the evening, well past the time Morgan usually had the private chef drop off their prepped organic meals. I walked quietly into the pristine kitchen. Leo looked up, his big brown eyes widening with a genuine, very bright smile. He was the only innocent soul in this entire toxic environment. He was wearing his private school uniform, though his tie was loosened, and his collar was slightly stained with what looked like apple juice. "Hey there, Grandpa," he chirped, kicking his feet against the wooden base of the island. "Hello, my boy," I said, my voice softening naturally as I approached him. I rounded the counter and looked down at his bowl. Instead of the balanced, nutritious dinner Morgan always boasted about to her friends, Leo was eating a large bowl of plain, generic, dry cereal. It was not even mixed with milk. He was just picking up the dry rings with his small fingers and chewing them thoughtfully. I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the sharp contrast between his vulnerability and the ruthless greed of his parents. Leo, why are you eating dry cereal for dinner? Did the chef forget to drop off the meal today? Or is your mother cooking something special later? Leo shook his head, his focus returning to the handful of cereal. No, Grandpa. Mommy said we cannot have the chef anymore. She canceled the food. We have to eat the cheap food from the big store now. I pulled out the stool next to him and sat down, my heart beginning to beat with a slow, heavy rhythm. I kept my voice incredibly gentle, hiding the sudden spike of alarm that was coursing through my veins. What do you mean? Leo, did Mommy say exactly why? He chewed for a moment, his innocent face scrunching up in thought, as he tried to recall the exact words his mother had used. Yes, she told me just last night when I asked for a warm cheese pizza. She said we are very poor right now because Daddy's company needs all of our money. She said Daddy is building something huge and we have to sacrifice. So no more chef and no more pizza delivery. Just cereal and sandwiches until Daddy gets rich again. The words hung in the quiet kitchen air, innocent and utterly devastating. We are very poor right now. Daddy's company needs all of our money. I stared at the bowl of cheap generic cereal. The same boy whose father claimed he was in the middle of a massive multi-million-dollar corporate funding round. He was sitting in a $3.5 million mansion, eating dry cereal because his parents claimed they were broke. The story Derek had fed me the night before, the plausible lie about his startup, expanding too fast, began to crumble rapidly. A successful founder might have his equity tied up, but he does not cancel his child's dinners. He does not tell his 7-year-old son that they are impoverished. Before I could ask Leo another question, the heavy mahogany front door swung open with a loud, dramatic creak. The sharp, rapid clicking suddenly sounded loudly. Expensive high heels echoed across the marble foyer. Morgan was home. She breezed into the kitchen, a whirlwind of designer perfume and perfectly styled hair. But it was not her appearance that made the breath catch in my throat. It was what she was carrying. Hooked over her slender forearms were 3 massive, glossy shopping bags. The iconic green and red stripes of Gucci were unmistakable. The bags were bulging heavy with luxury garments and leather goods. She heaved them onto the quartz countertop with a loud thud, right next to Leo's sad bowl of very boring dry cereal. "Oh, my feet are absolutely killing me," she sighed dramatically, kicking off her heels and massaging her arches. The charity luncheon went 2 hours over, and then I just had to stop by the boutique downtown. My personal shopper pulled a few exclusive pieces for me, and I simply could not say no. It was a complete emergency. I have absolutely nothing to wear for the gala next weekend. She finally seemed to notice me sitting there. She paused, her bright smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. "Oh, hello there, Robert. I did not see you there. I thought you would be resting in your room." I looked at the towering stack of luxury shopping bags. I looked at the crisp embossed logos. I estimated there was easily $10,000 or $15,000 worth of merchandise sitting on the counter. Then very slowly, I lowered my gaze to my grandson. Leo was quietly picking another dry cereal ring out of his bowl, completely ignoring the mountain of wealth sitting inches from his face. He had clearly accepted the narrative that they were completely destitute. I looked back at Morgan again. The math failed. If Derek was struggling to pay for Leo's education, how could Morgan drop a fortune on clothes in a single afternoon? The gut feeling I had experienced the previous night escalated into a screaming, deafening alarm inside my head. The power of attorney was simply a desperate, dangerous weapon. They were desperate to access my assets because they were hiding a catastrophic financial disaster. I stood up, keeping my voice flat. I was just keeping Leo company, Morgan. I will leave you to your evening. I turned and walked away slowly. As soon as I was out of sight, my posture straightened. The time for passive observation was over. I decided it was time to actively dig for the hard truth. Saturday morning arrived with the chaotic energy that usually accompanied their weekend routines. They rushed around the massive kitchen dressed in perfectly tailored attire. Derek adjusted a platinum watch on his wrist, while Morgan sprayed a final mist of expensive perfume over her neck. They announced they were heading to a high-profile networking brunch in downtown Seattle, an exclusive event for tech founders and venture capitalists. They told me they would be gone for at least 4 hours and asked if I could keep an eye on Leo, who was currently occupied with a building block set in the living room. I smiled warmly, pouring myself a cup of black coffee. I told them to take their time and enjoy the event. I assured them that Leo and I would be perfectly fine. Derek gave me a brisk pat on the shoulder, completely unaware of the storm brewing behind my eyes. The heavy front door clicked shut, and the gravel crunch of their luxury SUV faded down the long driveway. The moment they were gone, the facade dropped. I did not waste a single second. I called my longtime housekeeper, Maria, who lived just exactly 2 streets over, and asked if she could come sit with Leo for an hour. She agreed immediately. I changed out of my comfortable cardigan and put on a crisp blazer. I walked into the garage, got into my quiet sedan, and backed out onto the street. My destination was not a golf course or a quiet park. I was heading directly to the primary branch of my bank in downtown Bellevue. The drive took less than 20 minutes, but my mind raced through decades of financial planning during every single mile. When I handed Derek the reins to certain family accounts, I did it out of trust. I had set up a private education trust fund for Leo the week he was born. It was designed to cover his private school tuition, his future college expenses, and perhaps a down payment on his first home. It was a bulletproof account, or so I thought. I had made Derek a co-manager on that specific trust, wanting him to feel the responsibility of fatherhood and financial stewardship. It was a gesture of faith from a father to a son. Now I needed to know exactly how that faith had been handled. I walked directly through the heavy glass doors of the bank, greeted by the familiar hush of the lobby and the subtle scent of polished wood. The branch manager, an older gentleman named Arthur, who had managed my corporate accounts during the height of my logistics business, spotted me immediately. He stood up from his desk, a look of genuine surprise and respect on his face. It had been nearly a year since I had come into the branch in person. We shook hands, and I took a seat in his private glass-walled office. I did not engage in the usual pleasantries. I told Arthur that I needed a complete detailed ledger of the education trust fund set up for my grandson Leo. Arthur nodded, his fingers moving quickly over his keyboard. He smiled as he worked, mentioning how generous it was for me to set up such a robust safety net for the next generation. I just watched his face. I watched the friendly professional smile slowly melt away. I watched his brow furrow as he scrolled down the screen. He adjusted his glasses, completely silent, clicking his mouse with a sudden nervous energy. The air in the office grew incredibly thick and heavy. Arthur looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and deep concern. He hesitated, clearing his throat before speaking. He asked if Derek had spoken to me recently about the asset reallocation strategy for the trust. I kept my voice perfectly flat and steady. I told him Derek had not mentioned any new strategy. I asked Arthur to print the ledger and place it on the desk. He stood up, walked over to the secure printer in the corner, and retrieved a stack of 3 papers. He placed them in front of me, his hand lingering on the top page. He quietly explained that over the past 8 months, there had been a series of massive, sustained withdrawals. I pulled my reading glasses from my pocket and looked down at the black and white numbers. The initial balance of $400,000, a sum I had carefully curated and grown through conservative investments, was completely gone. The bottom line showed a remaining balance of just under $200. It was not a market fluctuation. It was not a bad investment portfolio. It was a systematic bleeding. Every 2 weeks, a sum of exactly $25,000 or sometimes $50,000 had been wired out of the trust. I traced my finger along the destination column. Every single withdrawal had been routed to the exact same external corporate account. The beneficiary name was listed simply as Apex Solutions. I asked Arthur what Apex Solutions was, He tapped his keyboard again, pulling up the routing information. He explained that it was an external limited liability company, but because it was outside their banking network, he could not see the operating officers or the exact nature of the business. However, the authorization signatures for every single transfer belonged exclusively to Derek. Because Derek was listed as a co-manager on the trust, the bank had processed the requests without flagging them as fraudulent. It was completely legal on their end. Derek had the authority to move the funds, and he had used that authority to drain his own son's future dry. I thanked Arthur for his time, folded the ledger neatly, and placed it inside my inner jacket pocket. I stood up, shook his hand, and walked out of the bank with a slow, deliberate pace. I did not stumble. I did not show an ounce of sudden weakness. But the moment I reached the privacy of my car, I closed the door and gripped the leather steering wheel with both hands. The leather creaked under the immense pressure of my grip. The silence of the car felt deafening. I closed my eyes and the memories came flooding back with a brutal, unapologetic force. I remembered the year 1985. I was 39 years old trying to build my logistics company from a single rented warehouse near the Seattle docks. I remembered working 80-hour weeks coordinating freight schedules until my eyes burned and my hands shook from exhaustion. There were nights I did not even drive home. I would just lay a heavy moving blanket over a stack of wooden shipping pallets in the back of the freezing warehouse and sleep for 3 hours before the morning shift arrived. I sacrificed my health, my youth, and my comfort. I ate cheap canned soup and wore boots with holes in the soles. I did all of it for one singular reason. I wanted Derek to have the life I never had. I wanted to pay for his college tuition in cash, so he would never really know the crushing weight of student debt. I built an empire on calloused hands and sleepless nights just to give him a foundation of absolute security. And now this man, this boy I had given everything to, had stolen $400,000 from his own 7-year-old child. He had reached into the safety net I built for Leo and ripped it to shreds to feed whatever dark hidden disaster he was desperately trying to conceal under the name Apex Solutions. He had robbed his own flesh and blood while forcing his wife to parade around in luxury clothing to maintain a pathetic illusion of wealth. The sheer depravity of his actions washed over me, stripping away the last remaining layers of my paternal forgiveness. A normal father might have broken down right then and there. A normal father might have rested his head against the steering wheel and wept for the loss of his son's morality. A normal father might have felt a crushing, paralyzing despair. But I did not shed a single tear. My eyes were completely dry. The profound grief that had been building inside my chest suddenly crystallized, hardening into something extremely dense, cold, and incredibly and brutally lethal. It was a pure, unadulterated rage, but it was not chaotic. It was focused. It was the same cold, calculating energy that I had used to crush predatory competitors and dismantle corrupt suppliers in my corporate days. Derek had not just made a mistake. He had declared war on the most vulnerable member of our family. He had proven that he possessed no loyalty, no honor, and absolutely no limits. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The tired old man was completely gone. I pulled the bank statement from my pocket, looking at the name Apex Solutions one last time. I needed to know exactly what this company was. I needed to know where the money went, who he owed, and how deep this rot truly ran. Confrontation without complete information was a tactical error I absolutely refused to make. I picked up my mobile cell phone. The real devastating war against my own son had officially begun, starting right here, right now. The rain started just as I crossed the city limits, a cold and relentless drizzle that blurred the neon lights of the passing strip malls. I drove south, leaving the manicured lawns and towering glass facades of Bellevue far behind. The roads grew narrower, the pavement cracked and extremely uneven. I was heading directly into an industrial sector, a massive maze of corrugated steel warehouses and dimly lit intersections. I pulled my sedan into the gravel parking lot, of an old 24-hour diner. It was a relic from a forgotten decade, glowing with a flickering yellow neon sign that buzzed audibly in the damp air. This was definitely not the sort of place tech visionaries or wealthy housewives ever frequented. It was exactly why I purposely chose it. I stepped out into the rain, pulling the collar of my blazer up against the chill, and walked through the heavy glass door. The bell chimed overhead. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, fried grease, and old vinyl. The diner was nearly empty, save for a tired trucker at the counter and a waitress wiping down a distant table. I walked past the counter, my boots scuffing against the checkered linoleum floor, and headed straight for the last booth in the darkest corner of the room. Waiting for me was Mitchell. Mitchell was 65 years old, a man whose face was mapped with deep lines and a lifetime of ruthless corporate warfare. He was wearing a rumpled gray trench coat over a dark turtleneck, looking more like a tired detective than one of the most feared estate and corporate attorneys in the Pacific Northwest. Mitchell and I went back 30 years. We had fought shoulder to shoulder in the trenches of the logistics industry. When rival companies tried to bleed me dry with frivolous lawsuits, Mitchell was the man who systematically dismantled them. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that pointed strictly toward victory for his clients. He was my oldest ally, and he was the only man I absolutely trusted with what I was about to do. He did not offer a polite smile as I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. He simply pushed a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee toward me. "You sounded like you were preparing for a funeral on the phone," Robert Mitchell said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the hum of the diner refrigerators. "Not a funeral, Mitchell," I replied, wrapping my cold hands around the warm mug. "A resurrection." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and withdrew the folded bank ledger. I smoothed out the creases with the palm of my hand and slid the document across the sticky surface of the table. "I need you to tell me what this is," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet. "I need you to find everything you can about an entity called Apex Solutions." Mitchell pulled a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from his coat pocket and slid them onto his face. He picked up the ledger, his eyes scanning the columns of numbers. He saw the initial balance. He saw the steady, methodical bleeding of the account. He saw the final remaining balance of less than $200. His jaw tightened. He did not ask unnecessary questions. He knew exactly what an education trust fund was, and he knew I had set this one up for my grandson. Without saying a single word, Mitchell reached down into his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick black laptop. He flipped it open, the stark blue light illuminating his weathered face. Mitchell had access to shadow databases and financial registries that most ordinary lawyers did not even know existed. He typed rapidly, the keys clicking with a sharp, staccato rhythm. "Give me 5 minutes," he murmured, his eyes locked on the screen. I drank the bitter coffee, watching the rain streak the dirty window beside us. I waited as Mitchell navigated through public records, offshore corporate registries, and hidden financial networks. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy. Finally, Mitchell stopped typing. He leaned back against the vinyl booth, pulling his glasses off and tossing them onto the table. He rubbed his eyes, letting out a long, heavy breath. He looked at me, and for the first time in 30 years, I saw something resembling pity in his eyes. I stared back, my expression hardening into stone. "Do not look at me like that, Mitchell. Just give me the absolute truth. Do not filter a single word. Tell me everything." Mitchell sighed again and turned the laptop screen so I could see the cascading lines of data. "Apex Solutions is a shell company," Robert Mitchell said, his voice flat and strictly professional. "It was incorporated in Nevada roughly 14 months ago. The listed managing director is a proxy firm, but the primary beneficiary of the holding accounts is your son. Derek controls it entirely." I nodded slowly, absorbing the brutal confirmation. "So, he is funneling the trust money into his own pockets." "But why?" "He told me this morning that his startup is in the middle of closing a massive Series B funding round. He claimed he was just temporarily cash poor. Mitchell let out a dark, humorless chuckle. A Series B funding round. Robert Derek's tech startup does not exist anymore. It went completely bankrupt over a year ago. The words struck me, but I did not flinch. I just stared at the illuminated screen. Bankrupt, completely insolvent. Mitchell confirmed, tapping the screen with a blunt fingernail. His primary investors pulled out 14 months ago, when he failed to deliver a single working prototype. The company was quietly dissolved to avoid public bankruptcy filings. There is no startup. There is no funding round. Your son has been unemployed for over a year. He has been playing pretend. I took a slow breath, digesting the magnitude of the lie. The late nights pacing the floor, the frantic typing on the laptop, the crisp white dress shirts. It was all a theatrical performance, an entire life built on an empty, hollow stage. Then where is the money going? I asked, my voice as cold as absolute ice. $400,000 does not just vanish into thin air. He has not been paying for Leo's private school. Morgan is carrying around $10,000 in Gucci shopping bags. What is feeding this massive fire? Mitchell began typing again, bringing up a new set of deeply buried financial records. It is a two-front war, Robert Mitchell explained, pointing to a series of massive wire transfers originating from the Apex account. First, you have Derek. He is a severe gambling addict. And I am not talking about legal sports betting or weekend trips to Las Vegas. I am talking about high-stakes, illegal underground poker rings. He owes massive debts to dangerous people who do not send polite collection letters. They send ruthless enforcers. Over the past 8 months, he has wired almost $200,000 to overseas accounts that flag immediately for illicit gaming syndicates. He has been using his own son's education fund to keep his kneecaps completely intact. I felt a physical wave of nausea roll through me, followed immediately by a surge of white-hot fury. And the rest, I demanded. What about the other $200,000? Mitchell scrolled down, revealing a cascade of credit card statements and exorbitant luxury retail invoices. The rest is funding Morgan's pathological shopping addiction. She is burning through $30,000 a month on designer clothes, private Pilates instructors, organic chefs, and extensive cosmetic procedures. They are drowning in unmanageable credit card debt. They have taken out secondary loans against their luxury cars. They are completely destitute, Robert. They are living a lavish lifestyle they absolutely cannot afford by cannibalizing everything around them. I looked away from the screen, staring out the rainy window into the bleak night. My son was a total fraud and a degenerate gambler. My daughter-in-law was a shallow, parasitic consumer. They had burned through their own money. They had blatantly stolen my innocent grandson's future, and now they were aggressively coming for me. The power of attorney document was not just a mere precaution. It was a desperate, panicked grab for a vital lifeline. They desperately needed my pension, my investment portfolios, and my remaining capital to feed their bottomless pit of spiraling debt. I slowly turned my attention back to Mitchell. The tired, fading grandfather who walked into the Bellevue kitchen this morning was officially dead and permanently buried. The man sitting in this dingy diner booth was the relentless founder who had successfully crushed massive corporate empires. Mitchell closed the heavy laptop with a definitive sharp snap. Mitchell warned me Derek would do anything for my remaining fortune. Anticipate his next move. The rain was still falling in a steady freezing sheet when I stepped out of the diner and back into the dark parking lot. Mitchell had stayed behind in the booth, nursing his black coffee, his silent presence a comforting anchor in a world that had suddenly capsized. I gripped the collar of my coat against the wind and got into my car. The drive back to Bellevue was a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and blinding headlights. I had the truth now, cold and irrefutable. But having the truth was only the first half of the battle. Mitchell was absolutely right. If Derek was desperate enough to siphon his own son's future to appease violent underground loan sharks, there were no moral boundaries left. He was a cornered animal drowning in massive debt, with my remaining portfolio standing as his only possible salvation. The temporary power of attorney he had tried to push on me was not merely a backup plan. It was his primary offensive strategy. I needed to know the exact timeline of his next move. I needed to know who he was talking to, what leverage he thought he had, and how far he was willing to go. I could not rely on bank statements alone. I needed to hear the poison straight from the source. The following morning, after ensuring Derek and Morgan were thoroughly distracted by their own manufactured chaos, I drove to a nondescript strip mall on the outskirts of Redmond. Tucked between a failing dry cleaner and a discount vitamin shop was an electronics store that specialized in high-grade security and surveillance equipment. It was the exact kind of place catering to paranoid corporate executives and betrayed spouses. I pushed open the glass door, greeted by the sterile smell of plastic and ozone. The clerk behind the counter was a young man with thick glasses and a bored expression, clearly accustomed to customers who did not want to be asked too many questions. I approached the glass display case and asked for the most discreet, high-capacity audio recording device he had in stock. I specified that it needed to be completely voice-activated, possess a battery life that could last for several days, and have the capability to transmit a crystal-clear signal to a paired mobile receiver. The clerk nodded, without a word, reaching into a locked drawer behind the counter. He pulled out a tiny matte, black square, barely larger than a standard postage stamp. It was remarkably heavy for its incredibly small size, encased securely in a durable titanium shell. He explained the syncing process, demonstrating how the micro-recorder would lay dormant until it picked up a vocal frequency, at which point it would broadcast live audio directly to an encrypted application on my cellular phone. It was a sophisticated military-grade piece of hardware perfectly suited for my mission. I paid for it in cash, peeling the crisp bills from my silver money clip. I did not want a single digital trail leading back to my personal bank accounts. I walked out of the store, with the small device resting heavily in my pocket, feeling the cold weight of the metal against my leg. It was a weapon of absolute truth. I returned to the sprawling Bellevue mansion just before noon. The massive house was oppressively silent. Morgan had taken Leo to a weekend tutoring session, a ridiculous, overly expensive endeavor she used to justify her social standing among the other elite private school mothers. Derek was supposedly locked away securely in his home office, working diligently on the non-existent venture capital funding round. I stepped into the grand foyer, removing my heavy coat and hanging it inside the cedar closet with extremely deliberate slowness. I needed a completely flawless excuse to enter his private sanctum. I walked toward the sweeping grand staircase, expertly projecting the image of a forgetful, wandering old man. I deliberately scuffed my worn slippers against the imported marble, ensuring my slow approach was incredibly audible. I reached the landing and walked down the wide, carpeted hallway toward the heavy double doors of his office. I took a deep breath, smoothing my facial expression into a mask of benign, elderly confusion. I raised my right hand and knocked softly against the wood exactly twice. There was a sudden shuffling sound from within, followed by the heavy thud of a drawer being slammed shut. Derek's voice called out tight and visibly irritated, asking exactly who it was. I opened the door, just a tiny crack, peeking my head inside with a gentle, apologetic smile. "I am so terribly sorry to interrupt your extremely important work, Derek," I murmured, keeping my tone consistently light and very fragile. "I am just looking for that old historical biography of Winston Churchill. I thought I might have left it somewhere on one of your bookshelves last month." Derek was sitting rigidly behind his massive wooden desk. He was not looking at complex financial spreadsheets or venture capital term sheets. His sleek laptop screen was completely blank, resting quietly in an idle sleep mode. He was holding his cellular phone in a desperate vice grip, his knuckles stark white. He looked up at me, his eyes incredibly wide and completely bloodshot. He looked exactly like a terrified man standing precariously on the crumbling edge of a very high cliff. He forced a stiff, highly unnatural smile, quickly placing the dark phone face down on the black leather blotter. "It is perfectly fine, Dad," he said, his voice trembling slightly with barely contained panic. "Just check the wooden shelves on the left side of the room. I am simply waiting on a very critical conference call with my primary board of directors." I nodded gratefully and stepped fully into the spacious room. The home office was an absolute masterpiece of intimidation and forced corporate prestige. The walls were lined with dark walnut bookshelves filled perfectly with pristine, entirely unread hardcovers. But the indisputable centerpiece of the entire room was the desk. It was a custom-built solid mahogany executive desk, polished flawlessly to a gleaming mirror shine. It was a magnificent piece of masterful woodworking craftsmanship. I remembered the exact sunny day it was carefully delivered. I remembered writing the $15,000 check to the local artisan who meticulously built it. I had bought it as a proud congratulatory gift when Derek first announced he was officially launching his tech startup. I had been so overwhelmingly proud of his ambition, so eager to unconditionally support his brave entrepreneurial spirit. Now, walking slowly past that magnificent piece of carved wood, I felt a sickening, powerful wave of deep revulsion. I moved slowly toward the tall bookshelves on the far left side of the room, trailing my fingers gently along the smooth spines. I muttered quietly to myself, playing the pitiful part of the highly distracted senior citizen perfectly. Derek watched me closely for a brief moment, but his overwhelming anxiety quickly drew his attention back to his silenced phone. He picked it up again, his thumb hovering frantically over the glowing screen, completely absorbed in his own desperate hidden crisis. He was absolutely not paying any attention to my moving hands. This was my singular, fleeting window of tactical opportunity. I shuffled along the lower shelves until I was positioned directly behind the two large leather guest chairs, perfectly blocking his line of sight. I reached silently into my warm cardigan pocket and retrieved the tiny matte black micro-recorder. The flat back of the device was thickly lined with a highly powerful industrial adhesive. With a fluid, heavily practiced motion, I purposely dropped a heavy hardcover book directly onto the thick carpet. "Oh, my incredibly clumsy hands," I muttered aloud, bending down toward the floor with an exaggerated, pained groan. As I crouched precariously near the carpeted floor, I reached out my right hand and pressed the tiny titanium square directly underneath the overhanging lip of the $15,000 mahogany desk. The strong adhesive gripped the polished wood instantly. I pressed it firmly upward, ensuring it was completely hidden in the deep, unlit shadows of the desk frame. I picked up the fallen book, grunting convincingly, as I slowly stood back up to my full height. I brushed some imaginary dust off the cover and offered Derek a victorious, completely harmless smile. "I finally found it, son. I will graciously leave you to your highly important business calls right now." Derek did not even bother to look up from his bright phone screen. He just waved a quick, highly dismissive hand, entirely consumed by the invisible, catastrophic fires he was frantically trying to extinguish. I returned to my room, locked the door, and put on my headphones. I synced the receiver to my phone and waited in the quiet dark. I sat perfectly still, exactly like a predator, waiting for its prey to step into the trap. The next 48 hours required a level of discipline I had not exercised since my most ruthless corporate negotiations. I played the role of the frail, forgetful grandfather to absolute perfection. I shuffled through the expansive Bellevue mansion, nodded politely at Morgan, and smiled vaguely whenever Derek asked if I had found the time to review his so-called simple legal documents. I told him my eyes were still bothering me, but I promised I would sit down with the paperwork very soon. He clenched his jaw, masking his irritation with a tight, unconvincing nod. Every passing hour felt like walking barefoot across a floor covered in shattered glass, but I knew I had to maintain the illusion. My survival depended on my complete commitment to the performance. On Tuesday afternoon, a crisp, overcast autumn day, I told Morgan I was going for a short walk to get some fresh air. I put on a thick wool coat, grabbed my walking stick, and slowly made my way out the heavy front doors. I walked past the manicured lawns of my wealthy neighbors, moving steadily, until I reached a quiet municipal park about a mile from the house. The park was mostly empty, populated only by a few distant dog walkers and the rustle of dry leaves tumbling across the pavement. I found a secluded wooden bench, heavily shadowed by a massive oak tree, and sat down. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out my mobile phone, my fingers completely steady. I retrieved a pair of wireless headphones, placed them securely over my ears, and opened the encrypted application the technician had installed. The interface was stark and simple. I tapped the activation icon. For a few long moments, there was only the faint, rhythmic sound of static hiss. Then the audio cleared with sudden, terrifying sharpness. I could hear the faint ambient hum of the central climate control in Derek's home office. I could hear the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. The microphone I had hidden beneath the $15,000 mahogany desk was picking up every single sound with devastating clarity. I sat there on the cold wooden bench, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders, waiting. I fully expected to hear Derek making frantic calls to his lawyers begging for legal loopholes. I expected to hear him brainstorming ways to forge my signature on the power of attorney document, or perhaps plotting how to illegally drain my pension accounts through digital fraud. I was prepared for financial treachery. I was prepared for the ultimate corporate betrayal. But what I actually heard over the next 10 minutes was something far more sinister, something that stripped away the last remaining illusions I held about the boy I had raised. The heavy office door clicked open. The sound of Morgan's expensive heels echoed sharply against the hardwood floor. She was pacing. I could hear her frantic, irregular footsteps tracing a tight circle right in front of Derek's desk. Her breathing was shallow and incredibly fast. "Derek, we have a massive problem," Morgan whispered. Her voice was not the polished, arrogant tone she used when ordering around the domestic staff. It was a raw, trembling hiss. It was the sound of a woman standing on the edge of total ruin. I heard the leather of Derek's executive chair creak as he leaned forward. "What is it now, Morgan? I am trying to figure out how to restructure this debt before Friday." Morgan stopped pacing. The bookie called again, Derek. He called my personal cell phone this time. I do not even know how he got my private number. He was not polite. He told me the grace period is officially over. They want the $150,000 by the absolute end of the month. He said if we miss this deadline, they are not going to send another warning. They are going to send someone to the house. A cold chill completely unrelated to the autumn wind swept through my body. $150,000 by the end of the month. The sheer magnitude of their underground debt was staggering. They had already drained Leo's $400,000 education trust, and it was still not enough to cover the massive crater of Derek's gambling losses and Morgan's unchecked luxury spending. They were drowning, and the water was rising fast. "Tell them we need just a few more days," Derek replied, his voice tight and defensive. "Tell them I am liquidating an asset. Tell them whatever you have to tell them, Morgan. Just buy me some time. Buy you some time." Morgan's whisper pitched upward into a frantic squeak. "Derek, these are not credit card companies. These are dangerous, violent people. They do not care about your excuses. If the old man does not sign that power of attorney tomorrow, we lose absolutely everything. We lose the house, we lose the cars, and we might actually lose our lives. We need his accounts cleared out by Friday, or we are finished." I gripped the wooden slats of the park bench. My own son had essentially put a price tag on my head. He had leveraged his family's safety against his illegal debts, and his only extraction strategy was to entirely strip his father of every single asset I possessed. He was not just a failure as a businessman. He was a profound failure as a husband, a father, and a human being. The audio feed picked up the sound of Derek slamming his hands flat against the mahogany desk. The sharp thud echoed directly into my ears. "I know exactly what is at stake, Morgan." Derek growled, his voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute darkness. "Do not panic. Just keep playing the part. Keep bringing him his stupid tea and acting like the perfect, loving daughter-in-law. He is going to sign the document tomorrow. I guarantee it." How can you possibly guarantee that Morgan demanded her panic completely unsoothed? He is dragging his feet. He said he wants to read it over the weekend. He is an old, stubborn mule. What if he refuses? What if he actually reads the clauses and figures out what you are doing? We cannot physically force him to hold the pen. The silence that followed her question was thick and heavy. I could hear the faint rustle of paper as Derek presumably reached into his desk drawer. When he finally spoke again, the sheer lack of emotion in his voice made my blood run entirely cold. It was the voice of a complete stranger. He is not going to have a choice, Derek said smoothly, and he certainly will not have the cognitive ability to understand a single word on that page. I went to the clinic this morning. Dr. Aris gave me the prescription today. A prescription. The word dropped into my ears like a heavy stone plunging into a dark, bottomless well. I stopped breathing. The autumn wind completely vanished, leaving me entirely isolated within the terrifying reality of his words. What are you talking about? Morgan asked, her voice trembling with a new distinct flavor of fear. What prescription, Derek? It is a heavy, fast-acting sedative, Derek explained calmly, as if he were discussing a minor software update. Dr. Aris prescribed it off the record. It is practically tasteless. We mix it into his chamomile tea tomorrow evening. By the time it hits his bloodstream, he will be completely compliant, highly confused, and incredibly docile. He will barely know his own name, let alone understand the legal implications of a power of attorney document. We just guide his hand to the signature line, and the notary I hired will stamp it without asking any questions. And if he tries to fight it later, the medical clauses in the document will allow us to officially declare him mentally incompetent. He will be locked away in a memory care ward by the end of the week, and we will have full, unrestricted access to every single dollar he owns. I sat frozen on the park bench. The monstrous reality of his plan settled over me, suffocating and absolute. He was going to poison me. My own flesh and blood, the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to provide for, was planning to systematically drug me and lock me in a psychiatric ward just to cover his pathetic, reckless debts. The scale of the betrayal transcended greed. It was pure, unadulterated evil. I reached up with a remarkably steady hand and gently pulled the wireless headphones from my ears. The feed went silent. I looked out across the quiet, peaceful park, watching a single dry leaf drift slowly to the cold pavement. The time for sorrow had officially passed. Tomorrow evening, they wanted to serve me poison. I was going to serve them absolute ruin. I knew I had to hear every single detail. I could not afford to leave any stone unturned, no matter how much the sharp edges of the truth cut into my heart. With a remarkably steady hand, I placed the wireless headphones back over my ears. I pressed the padded speakers hard against the sides of my head, blocking out the ambient noise of the desolate autumn park. I reached into my coat pocket, found the volume dial on my mobile device, and pushed it up to its absolute maximum limit. The faint hiss of the digital audio feed filled my ears, accompanied by the muffled hum of the climate control unit, blowing cool air through the vents of Derek's home office. I sat perfectly still on the cold wooden bench. I waited in the gathering shadows, feeling the crisp wind whip dry leaves across the pavement. The silence over the live audio feed was incredibly heavy, pregnant with the terrifying weight of the malicious secrets they were about to unfold. I braced my entire body, preparing for the absolute onslaught of treachery. The tense silence was broken by the sound of Derek shifting his weight in his expensive leather executive chair. When his voice came through the encrypted connection, it was stripped of the usual frantic, manufactured anxiety he displayed when discussing his fake startup company. He sounded completely calm, terrifyingly clinical, and utterly devoid of any human empathy. He began to explain the precise origins of Dr. Aris to his wife. This was not a respected medical professional from a prestigious local hospital. Derek explained that he had met Aris through one of his dangerous underground gambling connections. Aris was a man who had been stripped of his official medical license nearly a decade ago for gross ethical violations and massive prescription fraud. However, the disgraced doctor still operated quietly in the murky shadows of the city, providing illicit services off-the-record chemical compounds and entirely falsified medical documentation for desperate people willing to pay an incredibly steep price. Derek boasted about how much money he had promised the dirty doctor, assuring Morgan that Eris was reliable and completely morally bankrupt. He was the perfect ruthless accomplice for their domestic crime. I listened in absolute paralyzing horror as Morgan's voice drifted through the microphone. She did not express a single ounce of hesitation, guilt, or moral outrage at the introduction of this criminal element. Instead, she sounded morbidly fascinated by the dark mechanics of the plan. She asked Derek in a hushed whisper about the specific nature of the drug they were going to use against me. She wanted to ensure it would not raise immediate red flags if I somehow ended up in a hospital emergency room. Derek laughed, a short, arrogant sound that made the bile rise rapidly in my throat. He proudly explained that the heavy, untraceable chemical sedative Eris had provided was a highly specialized synthetic compound. It was specifically designed and utilized in foreign unregulated psychiatric wards to completely subdue aggressive, violent patients. It was incredibly potent, meticulously formulated, to leave absolutely no identifiable trace in a standard toxicological blood panel or routine urine screening. Derek detailed exactly how the insidious poisoning would systematically occur. He explained that the liquid compound was entirely colorless, completely odorless, and utterly tasteless. It would be incredibly easy to simply slip a few drops into the artisanal chamomile tea Morgan brewed for me every evening. Derek continued his horrific briefing, clinically outlining the precise, devastating physical and psychological effects the chemical compound would deliberately inflict upon my mind and my aging body. He spoke with the detached enthusiasm of a twisted scientist observing a trapped rat in a maze. He told Morgan that within just a few short days of regular measured ingestion, the heavy sedatives would begin to aggressively attack my central nervous system. I would start experiencing severe, debilitating memory loss. I would forget simple conversations, misplace common household objects, and violently struggle to recall recent events. The drug would intentionally induce a state of extreme, persistent cognitive confusion, completely muddying my thoughts and systematically destroying my ability to focus clearly. Furthermore, Derek proudly explained the toxic compound would quickly cause prominent involuntary physical tremors in my hands and a noticeable shuffling weakness in my legs. I would physically and mentally transform into the frail, broken, entirely incapacitated old man they desperately needed me to be. I sat completely motionless on the park bench, my hands clenched into tight fists, paralyzed by the sheer depravity of my own son, explicitly detailing the systematic chemical destruction of his father's brain. Morgan's voice chimed in again, her tone now vibrating with a sickening, eager anticipation that made my skin crawl. She asked Derek exactly what the next crucial phase of the plan would be once the heavy sedatives fully took hold of my vulnerable system. Derek smoothly explained the meticulous theatrical performance they would confidently put on for the rest of the unsuspecting world. Once my engineered chemical deterioration became undeniably obvious to anyone who looked at me, they would seamlessly begin playing the sympathetic roles of the deeply concerned, thoroughly devastated children. They would express profound, fabricated sorrow and heartbreaking worry to our wealthy neighbors, the diligent household staff, and any of my former corporate business associates who happened to call the house. They would carefully construct an impenetrable, entirely sympathetic narrative surrounding my sudden, tragic decline. Derek explained that this theatrical performance was absolutely critical to their success. It would perfectly insulate them from any outside suspicion, legal investigation, or uninvited scrutiny. Everyone would simply see a tragic, unavoidable medical tragedy befalling a beloved patriarch, and they would see Derek and Morgan as the noble, suffering caretakers trying desperately to manage an impossible crisis. No one would suspect that the loving son and devoted daughter-in-law were actually the ruthless architects of the entire collapse, With the public narrative perfectly established and my mind thoroughly compromised by the untraceable chemical sedatives, Derek meticulously detailed the final lethal legal maneuver. He explained that once I was sufficiently confused, visibly trembling, and completely incapable of basic rational thought, the dirty, unlicensed Dr. Aris would make a formal, highly documented house call. Aris would conduct a completely rigged, entirely fraudulent cognitive assessment right there in the grand living room of the Bellevue mansion. He would deliberately ask me simple questions that my heavily drugged, chemically battered mind would undoubtedly fail to successfully answer. Following this farcical, deeply criminal medical examination, Aris would officially sign and legally seal the fraudulent medical paperwork. He would legally and permanently declare me as suffering from severe, rapid-onset Alzheimer's disease. Derek's voice dripped with arrogant, absolute triumph as he explained that this completely fabricated medical diagnosis would instantly meet the strict legal threshold for total mental incompetence. At that precise critical moment, the hostile predatory power of attorney document he had forcefully shoved in my face the night before would become an absolute, undeniable legal necessity. With my signature violently coerced in a chemically induced haze or simply masterfully forged by his own hand, he would hold the absolute keys to my financial kingdom. The audio feed suddenly crackled with the sharp, unmistakable sound of Morgan laughing loudly. It was not a nervous, hesitant laugh, nor was it a reluctant, guilty chuckle. It was a bright, full-throated sound of genuine, unbelievably cruel amusement. She actually found the malicious, predatory brilliance of their horrific, murderous scheme deeply entertaining. Her harsh laughter echoed loudly through the small digital receiver and pierced directly into my eardrums, echoing the definitive sound of absolute, irredeemable moral bankruptcy. She had completely abandoned any lingering shred of basic human decency or familial loyalty. "Then we activate the POA," Morgan said, her voice practically singing with a dark, victorious, and overwhelmingly greedy glee. "We dump him in that cheap state-run facility downtown. You know, the miserable, depressing one that constantly smells like industrial bleach and boiled cabbage. And then we completely, permanently liquidate his entire portfolio. We sell off all the blue-chip stocks, we completely drain the massive remaining pension accounts, and we finally clear out all of these ridiculous, suffocating underground debts. We will be completely, wonderfully free, Derek. We will have absolutely everything we ever wanted, and we will never have to look at his miserable, confused, pathetic face ever again." The stark, brutal reality of their ultimate endgame hung heavily in the digital audio feed, a definitive, unapologetic sentence of total abandonment. I listened to Derek firmly agree with her, followed by the sharp, crystal-clear sound of expensive glass clinking together as they enthusiastically toasted to their impending stolen wealth and my impending agonizing doom. The chilling, incredibly casual banality of their monstrous celebration was the final unbreakable nail in the coffin. I reached up with incredibly slow, deliberate movements and firmly pulled the wireless headphones away from my ears, lowering them gently onto my lap. I stared out across the empty, freezing park, watching the wind strip the last dead leaves from the ancient oak tree. The loving father who had tirelessly raised Derek, the soft, forgiving man who had worked grueling 80-hour weeks and slept on freezing wooden pallets just to build a secure legacy for his beloved son, was officially, permanently dead. In his place, staring out at the cold, gray Seattle sky, the ruthless, deeply unforgiving logistics titan was officially reborn. I felt the familiar ice-cold adrenaline pumping through my veins. They had foolishly assumed I was a weak, vulnerable target ready to be slaughtered. But they had absolutely no idea the terrifying depth of the devastating, calculated vengeance I was about to meticulously unleash upon their fragile, entirely fraudulent lives. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and walked briskly away from the cold wooden bench. The crisp autumn air felt sharp in my lungs, a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness I had just witnessed through that digital audio feed. I climbed back into the driver's seat of my quiet sedan, my hands gripping the leather steering wheel with a renewed, unshakable purpose. I did not drive toward the police station. As a man who had spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of corporate law and high-stakes logistics, I knew exactly how the judicial system operated. The audio recording, captured by a hidden device placed without consent in a private home office, was entirely inadmissible. It was the fruit of the poisonous tree. If I walked into a precinct and handed them that file, any decent defense attorney would have the evidence thrown out before the ink on the police report was even dry. Worse, it would immediately tip Derek off. He would destroy the sedatives, pay off the unlicensed doctor, and completely bury his tracks. I could not afford to give him a single warning. I needed him to blindly walk into a devastating legal trap, completely convinced of his own untouchable brilliance, until the very moment the steel jaws snapped shut around him. I pulled my mobile phone from my pocket and dialed a highly secure number. Mitchell answered on the second ring, his low, gravelly voice cutting through the quiet of my car. "I need you to clear your schedule for the rest of the day." I told him, my tone stripped of any residual emotion. "I am driving directly to your private office. We are moving from reconnaissance to active warfare." Mitchell did not ask a single unnecessary question. He simply grunted his affirmation and ended the call. The drive back to the city was swift and deeply focused. When I arrived at Mitchell's discreet wood-paneled office, he was already waiting for me behind his massive desk. He had closed the heavy blinds, casting the room in a dim, serious light. I sat in the leather chair opposite him and laid out the entire horrific reality. I detailed the panic in Morgan's voice regarding the massive underground gambling debts. I explained the fast-approaching deadline dictated by violent loan sharks. And finally, with a voice as cold as glacial ice, I relayed Derek's meticulously calculated plan to chemically sedate me, forge a fraudulent medical diagnosis of rapid-onset Alzheimer's, and lock me away in a dismal psychiatric ward. I watched Mitchell's seasoned, weathered face harden into a mask of pure professional fury. He had seen the absolute worst of human nature during his long legal career, but the sheer intimate cruelty of a son planning to chemically destroy his own father's mind clearly struck a deeply personal chord. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "We cannot use the audio in a courtroom," Robert Mitchell stated bluntly, confirming my own initial assessment. "It is highly illegal surveillance, but it gives us the ultimate tactical advantage. We know his exact timeline, we know his exact methodology, and we know his exact pressure points. If he is desperate enough to poison you by the end of the month, he will make a fatal, sloppy mistake. We just need to give him the rope to hang himself." I nodded slowly in complete agreement. "Our first critical objective is to completely starve the beast. We have to secure every remaining liquid asset I possess before he attempts to activate his fraudulent power of attorney." Mitchell opened his encrypted laptop and immediately pulled up my master financial portfolio. "We need to construct an impenetrable fortress around your capital," he explained, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. "I am drafting the documents to immediately transfer the entirety of your remaining liquid wealth into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust. You will officially surrender direct, accessible control of these funds to a designated neutral third-party fiduciary. By legally distancing yourself from the assets, you render the power of attorney document entirely useless. Even if Derek successfully drugs you and secures that fraudulent signature, he will find absolutely nothing but locked vaults and impenetrable legal walls." We spent the next 2 hours meticulously executing the transfers. I signed mountain after mountain of digital authorizations, legally moving millions of dollars out of my personal checking and investment accounts. I watched the balances drop to zero, feeling an immense, powerful wave of immense satisfaction. Derek thought he was closing in on a massive life-saving fortune. He was completely unaware that the vault was already completely empty. I was systematically dismantling his lifeline while he was still busy counting his stolen gold. With the liquid capital securely fortified, I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and steepled my fingers together. "We have secured the cash," I said, softly staring directly into Mitchell's sharp eyes. Now we need to focus our attention on the primary asset. We need to handle the $3.5 million Bellevue mansion. Mitchell stopped typing and looked up, a dark, incredibly knowing smile slowly spreading across his face. He knew exactly what I was talking about. When I originally purchased that sprawling estate for my son, I had allowed him to handle all the daily utility bills, the property taxes, and the exorbitant homeowner association fees. I had done this deliberately to give him a profound sense of personal responsibility, to help him build his credit profile, and to make him feel like the undisputed master of his own castle. Derek genuinely believed that because he paid the monthly maintenance invoices, he was the true legal owner of the property. He paraded around the neighborhood, boasting to the wealthy neighbors about his magnificent real estate investment. Morgan constantly flaunted the luxurious custom kitchen and imported marble floors to her vapid social circle, completely convinced that her name was securely etched onto the master deed. But they were absolutely devastatingly wrong. I had never placed that property in Derek's name, nor had I placed it in Morgan's name. I had not even placed the house in my own personal name. As a veteran of aggressive corporate warfare, I always insulated my major investments. I had routed the entire $3.5 million cash purchase through an obscure holding company named RM Holdings, LLC. It was a private, unlisted entity that I controlled with absolute, unquestionable legal authority. Derek had never bothered to hire a competent lawyer to review the final closing documents. He was too arrogant, too blinded by the sparkling illusion of instant, unearned wealth to verify the actual legal structures holding his life together. He was living in a multi-million-dollar fortress, completely oblivious to the fact that he was nothing more than an easily removable temporary tenant. I reached across the wide mahogany desk and firmly tapped the polished surface. "I want you to sell the house, Mitchell," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality. "I want you to list the Bellevue property immediately. I do not care about maximizing the profit margins, and I do not care about waiting for the absolute perfect market conditions. I want a cash buyer only, and I want the fastest legal closing in state history. Find an aggressive corporate developer or a foreign investor looking for a rapid acquisition. I want the papers signed and the eviction notices legally drafted before the end of the month. I want to rip the very ground out from beneath his feet right when he thinks he has won the ultimate prize." Mitchell looked at me, the dark smile completely transforming into a look of profound, genuine respect. He recognized the brutal, beautiful symmetry of the entire operation. Derek was currently rushing to illegally steal his father's life, completely unaware that his own life was about to be rapidly, legally liquidated. Mitchell nodded slowly and decisively, already reaching for his encrypted phone to contact his most aggressive, highly confidential real estate brokers. "Consider it done, Robert." Mitchell promised, his gravelly voice filled with absolute conviction. "The property will be sold. The funds will be securely routed directly into your new blind trust, and your son will receive his mandatory 30-day notice to vacate before he can even blink." I stood up from the comfortable leather chair, feeling stronger and more focused than I had in a decade. I buttoned my thick wool coat, preparing to walk back into the battlefield of my own home. I was going to drink my evening tea. I was going to look my treacherous son directly in the eyes. I was going to play the tired, confused victim perfectly, completely masking the enormous, lethal storm raging inside my chest. The final absolute legal trap was now completely flawlessly set, waiting to be fiercely sprung. My ultimate glorious victory was undeniably assured. I am ready. Thursday evening descended upon the Bellevue mansion with a heavy, oppressive gloom. The rain from the previous night had finally stopped, leaving behind a thick blanket of gray fog that pressed tightly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand living room. I sat in my usual high-backed leather armchair near the unlit fireplace, a thick woolen blanket draped carefully over my knees. The physical setting was incredibly tranquil, but my mind was operating with the rapid, calculating precision of a military general awaiting an imminent enemy advance. I knew exactly what was coming. I had spent the entire afternoon mentally rehearsing every single physical movement, every subtle facial expression, and every deliberate vocal hesitation. The trap was fully set, the legal barricades were entirely secured, and all that remained was the final critical performance. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing my posture to reflect the image of a tired, rapidly declining old man. I slowed my breathing, closing my eyes halfway, as if simply staying awake required a monumental effort. The heavy oak doors of the living room creaked open, breaking the profound silence. I heard the soft, measured footsteps of my son approaching across the plush Persian rug. I did not immediately open my eyes. I waited until he was standing directly beside my chair, before blinking slowly, looking up at him with a perfectly crafted expression of mild, disoriented confusion. Derek was holding a small silver tray. Resting on the polished metal was a steaming porcelain teacup and a thick stack of stapled legal documents. His face was a masterful portrait of manufactured filial concern, but the tight, eager grip he maintained on the edge of the tray completely betrayed his predatory anticipation. "I brought you some special herbal tea, Dad." Derek said, his voice dripping with a sickening honeyed sweetness that made my stomach physically churn. "Morgan brewed it specifically for you. It has a lovely chamomile base to help you relax this evening. I know your joints have been bothering you, and we just want you to feel completely comfortable." I looked at the gently rising steam, knowing intimately that the liquid inside was heavily laced with a potent mind-altering chemical sedative designed to permanently strip away my cognitive faculties. "Thank you, Derek," I murmured, keeping my voice incredibly soft and slightly raspy. My throat felt genuinely dry, but I forced a weak, highly appreciative smile. "That is very thoughtful of you and Morgan." I slowly extended my right hand toward the silver tray. As my fingers approached the delicate porcelain handle, I deliberately initiated a pronounced, visible tremor. I let my hand shake violently, causing the porcelain cup to rattle sharply against the matching saucer. Derek watched the display with rapt attention. I could see a brief, terrifying flash of absolute triumph completely illuminate his dark eyes. He genuinely believed his psychological warfare was already taking a severe physical toll. I finally managed to grasp the handle, lifting the cup with a highly exaggerated, agonizing slowness. I brought the rim of the cup directly to my lips. I blew softly on the hot liquid, inhaling the fragrant, innocent scent of the chamomile. I tilted the cup upward, allowing the hot tea to merely wet my lower lip without ever actually letting a single drop pass my teeth. I let out a soft, contented sigh, lowering the cup back to my lap with trembling fingers. "It is quite warm," I whispered, staring vacantly at the stack of papers he had now placed firmly onto the small wooden side table next to my chair. "Perhaps I will just let it cool for a brief moment." Derek nodded quickly, practically vibrating with nervous, barely contained energy. "Take your time, Dad. But while we are sitting here together, I brought those legal documents we discussed yesterday. The power of attorney. It really is just standard boilerplate paperwork, strictly a formality to ensure Morgan and I can easily handle your medical directives and daily financial logistics if you ever feel too tired to manage them yourself." I looked at the papers, furrowing my brow to simulate deep, struggling comprehension. "I do not know, Derek," I said slowly, rubbing my temple. "My head feels incredibly foggy tonight. The words just look so complicated. I think I would much rather read them tomorrow morning when I am feeling a bit sharper." Derek's fake smile faltered instantly. The panic he had displayed in his office suddenly threatened to completely break through his carefully maintained facade. He needed this signature tonight. The underground loan sharks were not going to wait for my mental clarity. "Dad, please," Derek urged, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a highly persuasive, urgent whisper. "It is just a simple signature. You do not need to read every single boring legal clause. I have already had my attorneys review it thoroughly. It is completely safe. I just need to get it filed first thing tomorrow morning so we can set up the new healthcare proxies. Please just do this for me." I sighed heavily, playing the role of the utterly defeated patriarch, yielding to his aggressive son. "Very well," I mumbled, "but my pen is over there on the writing desk across the room. Could you be a good boy and fetch it for me? My legs are incredibly stiff this evening." Derek did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He spun around immediately, his back completely turned to me as he quickly strode across the vast living room toward the distant antique writing desk. This was my singular, fleeting window of opportunity. The moment his eyes were diverted, the frail, trembling old man instantly vanished. I moved with blinding fluid speed. I grabbed the porcelain teacup and leaned sharply to my left. Directly beside my chair sat a massive decorative potted ficus tree. Without making a single sound, I swiftly poured the entire contents of the poisoned chamomile tea deep into the dark, thirsty soil at the base of the thick trunk. I placed the empty porcelain cup completely back onto the silver saucer, just as Derek eagerly turned around, a heavy gold fountain pen clutched tightly in his hand. I immediately resumed my slumped posture, letting my right hand tremble pathetically on my knee. He walked back over and handed me the pen, his eyes darting quickly to the empty teacup. A look of profound, dark satisfaction washed over his face. He believed I had consumed the entire dose of the mind-destroying sedative. He quickly picked up the stack of documents and placed them onto my lap, pointing at the signature line at the bottom. "Just sign there, Dad," he instructed, his voice breathless with overwhelming greed. I took the gold pen. I forced my hand to shake as I pressed the metal nib against the crisp white paper. I deliberately ruined my normally perfect signature, creating a messy, illegible scrawl. Derek snatched the paper, a look of triumphant greed on his face. He patronizingly patted my shoulder. "Do not worry, Dad. I will take care of everything from here." I nodded weakly. "I know you will, son." Friday evening arrived with a sickening display of profound arrogance and fabricated wealth. Despite the crushing, insurmountable underground debts hovering over their heads, Derek and Morgan decided to host a lavish wine tasting party. The mansion was completely transformed into an exclusive social event. A team of hired caterers circulated through the grand living room carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and artisanal cheeses. The dining table was lined with dozens of incredibly expensive vintage wines bottles that Morgan had undoubtedly purchased using completely maxed-out credit cards. It was a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain the flawless illusion of high society success, a smokescreen designed to convince their shallow friends and local angel investors that Derek was still a rising tech visionary. I knew the absolute truth. I knew they were celebrating what they believed was their ultimate flawless victory over my finances. They genuinely thought the heavy sedative they had served me the night before was currently dissolving my brain. They thought they had entirely secured my entire portfolio with that forged power of attorney document. They forced me to sit in a high-backed wingback chair, tucked away in the darkest corner of the expansive living room. It was a strategic, highly calculated placement. They wanted me visible enough to serve as a tragic prop, but isolated enough so I could not actively engage in any meaningful conversation. I played my role with absolute, unwavering dedication. I wore a wrinkled cardigan. I let my shoulders slump forward, resting my chin against my chest. I maintained a vacant, entirely glassy stare, occasionally allowing my hands to tremble visibly against the armrests. I watched the elite guests mingle their expensive jewelry, catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. Morgan floated gracefully through the crowd, wearing a stunning designer gown, holding a glass of sparkling rose. Whenever a guest glanced in my direction, she would offer a deeply pained, incredibly brave smile, flawlessly playing the part of the devoted, suffering daughter-in-law, gracefully managing a tragic family burden. It was a sickening, highly rehearsed performance. I sat in my quiet corner, listening to the loud, arrogant chatter filling the room. Derek was holding court near the massive marble fireplace, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy local businessmen and potential venture capitalists. He looked incredibly smug, swirling a glass of dark red wine, his chest puffed out with completely unearned pride. He was spinning elaborate, entirely fictitious tales about his non-existent software company, bragging about phantom algorithms and massive impending corporate buyouts. He lied with such effortless, fluid ease that it was genuinely terrifying to witness. I watched him smile, knowing intimately that his entire world was a hollow, fragile shell. He had absolutely no idea that earlier that very afternoon, Mitchell had officially finalized the rapid cash sale of the entire Bellevue estate. He had no idea that the millions of dollars he thought he had successfully stolen were currently locked away securely inside an impenetrable blind trust. He was a dead man, walking proudly, showing off a castle that he no longer even legally occupied. As the evening wore on and the wine continued to flow freely, the volume in the grand living room grew increasingly loud and obnoxious. Derek, emboldened by the alcohol and the fawning attention shown of his shallow peers, began to lead his group of captivated investors directly toward my isolated corner. He wanted to use my manufactured misery to elevate his own twisted sense of nobility. He stopped just a few feet away from my chair, gesturing grandly around the opulent, meticulously decorated room. I kept my eyes focused blankly on the Persian rug, letting my right hand shake with a pathetic, rhythmic tremor. Derek took a slow, arrogant sip of his vintage wine, looking down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt, completely masked as filial devotion. "Yeah, I bought this place in cash," Derek boasted loudly, ensuring his voice carried clearly over the ambient music so every single investor could hear his massive lie. It was a solid, highly strategic real estate investment for the portfolio. Plus, I really needed the extra square footage. I took care of my old man, too. I moved him in with us so we could give him the proper round-the-clock supervision he requires. You know how it is with the elderly. You just have to step up and take the heavy reins when their minds start to go. It is a massive financial burden, of course, but family always comes absolutely first. A collective, sickening murmur of profound sympathy rippled smoothly through the small group of wealthy men. They nodded approvingly, raising their crystal wine glasses in a silent, respectful toast to Derek's incredible generosity and noble character. One of the men, a tall executive with slicked back hair, looked down at me with an expression of deep, condescending pity. "It is incredibly admirable of you, Derek," the executive murmured softly. "Alzheimer's is such a brutal, unforgiving disease. He does not even seem to know where he is tonight. It must be so incredibly difficult for you and Morgan to watch him completely fade away like this." Derek sighed heavily, placing a gentle, highly patronizing hand directly onto my trembling shoulder. "It breaks my heart every single day," Derek whispered, layering his voice with a thick, entirely fabricated sorrow. "But we do what we must. I just try to remember the strong, capable man he used to be, before his brain completely betrayed him." I stared down at the intricate patterns woven deeply into the expensive Persian rug. I listened to the thick, suffocating layers of his monstrous deception. He had stolen my grandson's future. He had explicitly conspired to drug me into permanent oblivion. He had attempted to legally rob me of every single penny I had earned over a lifetime of grueling, relentless labor. And now he was standing in a house he did not own, drinking wine he could not afford, using my supposed mental destruction as a cheap, pathetic parlor trick to impress a room full of strangers. The sheer, unbounded audacity of his actions washed over me, completely erasing any lingering trace of paternal hesitation. The time for playing the helpless, fragile victim was officially over. The heavy, calculated tremor in my right hand instantly vanished. My fingers stopped shaking, resting completely still and incredibly firm against the leather armrest. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the warm, perfume-scented air of the crowded room. I let the false, vacant glaze completely clear from my eyes, replacing the manufactured fog with a sharp, piercing, and devastatingly cold clarity. I did not say a single word. I simply placed my hands flat against the sturdy arms of the wingback chair and pushed myself upward. The movement was incredibly smooth, completely devoid of the slow, agonizing stiffness I had rigorously faked for the past 48 hours. I stood up to my full height, straightening my spine and pulling my shoulders back. The slumped, defeated posture of the broken old man instantly dissolved entirely, replaced by the towering, commanding physical presence of the ruthless corporate titan who had built an empire from nothing but pure steel and absolute willpower. I turned my head slowly, locking my entirely clear, completely lucid eyes directly onto Derek's face. The patronizing, arrogant smile completely froze on my son's lips. His hand still hovering awkwardly in the air, where my slumped shoulder used to be, began to tremble slightly. He stared at me, his eyes widening in sudden, profound confusion, as his brain desperately tried to reconcile the frail, chemically sedated victim he expected with the terrifyingly alert, powerful man currently standing right in front of him. The surrounding investors fell entirely silent, confused by the abrupt, shocking transformation they were witnessing. I did not break eye contact with Derek. I stepped out of the dark, isolated corner, leaving the shadows behind me, and walked with firm, heavy, and undeniably authoritative steps directly into the brightly lit center of the lavish party. The heavy silence that instantly fell over the grand living room was absolutely deafening. The ambient jazz music playing softly from the hidden speakers seemed to entirely fade away, swallowed by the sudden, suffocating tension. Every single eye in the lavish room was locked securely onto me. The wealthy investors, the socialite friends, and the hired caterers holding silver trays of expensive caviar all stood completely frozen like ornamental statues. Derek took a hesitant step backward, his polished leather shoes slipping slightly on the expensive Persian rug. His mind was clearly struggling to process the impossible reality standing directly there. The frail, heavily sedated old man he had openly mocked just moments ago had completely vanished into thin air. In his place stood the commanding, deeply unforgiving founder of a massive logistics empire. Derek swallowed hard, his throat bobbing visibly under his crisp collar. He plastered a highly nervous, incredibly fake smile onto his pale face and stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand as if he were approaching a highly volatile psychiatric patient. "Dad, let us get you back to bed," Derek said, his voice cracking with panicked desperation. "You are clearly having another one of your confused episodes. The loud noise out here is just overwhelming your fragile system right now." I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply stood my ground, exuding a lethal, terrifying calmness that instantly commanded the absolute attention of every single person in that lavish room. "Do not patronize me, Derek," I said, my voice echoing with a deep, resonant authority that cut cleanly through the thick, tense air. My mind has never been clearer, and my memory is absolutely flawless tonight. I reached directly inside the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and swiftly retrieved a heavy manila folder. I walked forward with measured, incredibly deliberate steps, closing the distance between us. The wealthy guests automatically parted, creating a wide, undeniable path for me. I stopped directly in front of the massive glass coffee table situated in the center of the room. I raised the thick manila folder and dropped it forcefully onto the glass surface. The sharp, heavy smack echoed loudly, making several of Morgan's shallow friends physically jump in shock. "That folder contains the absolute truth about your brilliant tech visionary," I announced, addressing the captivated room, while keeping my cold eyes strictly fixed onto my son. "There is no Series B funding round. There is no revolutionary software algorithm. Derek's precious startup went completely bankrupt over 14 months ago." A collective gasp rippled through the gathering of elite investors. Derek's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words materialized. "He is completely unemployed." I continued, my voice entirely merciless and steady. "He has been parading around in tailored suits, playing the role of the highly successful entrepreneur, while actively dodging violent underground loan sharks on a daily basis now. He owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to illegal high-stakes gambling syndicates. And to fund this pathetic illusion to pay for the designer gowns his wife is currently wearing, he resorted to the lowest form of theft imaginable." I pointed an accusatory finger directly at Derek's chest. He completely drained his own 7-year-old son's private education trust fund. He systematically stole $400,000 from Leo to save his own kneecaps from the violent enforcers he foolishly indebted himself to. Morgan pushed her way quite forcefully through the crowd of stunned guests, her face completely flushed. She stood fiercely beside her terrified husband. "He is completely crazy," Morgan screamed loudly, her voice shrill and echoing wildly off the high ceilings. "Do not listen to a single word he says today. His brain is thoroughly diseased right now. He is suffering from rapid-onset Alzheimer's, and we have the official medical documents to prove it. Derek already holds the official power of attorney over all his financial assets. We are the ones legally in charge here. He does not even know what he is saying." I let out a short, incredibly cold laugh that instantly silenced her. It was a laugh utterly devoid of any genuine humor or human warmth. "That fraudulent power of attorney document is completely worthless, Morgan," I stated firmly, watching her eyes widen in sudden sheer panic. "You foolishly thought you could chemically sedate me and legally steal my wealth while I was incapacitated, but you were entirely too late. Every single dime I own, every investment portfolio, and every massive pension account was legally moved into an impenetrable, irrevocable blind trust yesterday afternoon. You have absolutely zero access to my money today." The desperate smirk on Derek's face completely collapsed, leaving nothing. He looked around the entire room, his eyes darting frantically, as the walls of his massive lie rapidly closed in. "Well, we still own this magnificent house," Derek sneered loudly, his voice shaking with a pathetic, deeply desperate defiance. "We are currently standing in my private property, and I want you to leave right now." I slowly shook my head, offering him a look of profound, deeply devastating pity. "No, Derek, you absolutely do not," I corrected him calmly, my voice ringing with finality. "RM Holdings, LLC officially owns this spectacular house, and I am the sole undisputed proprietor forever. You were never the actual homeowner here. You were just a temporary, highly expendable tenant who was generously allowed to pay the utility bills. And because you explicitly proved yourself to be a treacherous, thieving liability, I terminated your lease today. I sold this entire property directly to a highly aggressive commercial real estate conglomerate at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. They paid $3.5 million in pure cash, and the transaction is already fully finalized and permanently recorded. You do not own this house, you do not have my money, and you have absolutely nowhere left to hide your massive failures anymore." The wealthy guests stood in a state of absolute paralyzed shock, completely speechless, as the magnificent illusion of Derek and Morgan's high society life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The caterers quietly slipped out of the room, abandoning their expensive silver trays entirely. The absolute silence returned, but this time it was the definitive sound of a complete and total destruction. Derek and Morgan stood entirely frozen in the center of the grand living room, their eyes wide with profound, paralyzing horror. The vibrant color completely drained from their faces as the devastating, brutal reality finally washed completely over them. They realized with absolute terrifying certainty that they had absolutely nothing left to their names. No house, no stolen trust fund, no massive pension accounts to illegally pillage. The ruthless loan sharks were still waiting for their massive payment, and they had absolutely no way to pay them. The pathetic empire they had desperately tried to build on my back was completely annihilated. I turned around and walked proudly toward the heavy front doors. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, leaving them to inevitably drown in their very own spectacular ruin. The heavy thud of this brass knocker against the front door sounded like a judge's gavel, echoing through the empty, cavernous foyer. I stood in the upstairs hallway, my shadow stretching long and dark across the polished floorboards, watching through the security camera feed as a process server dressed in a sharp gray suit handed a thick, certified envelope to a pale, visibly shaking Derek. He didn't even have time to open it before his phone began to vibrate violently in his hand, his thumb slipping twice on the screen before he answered. Even from the top of the stairs, I could hear the sharp, aggressive barks of his debt collector, a sound that pierced the air with the cold finality of a death sentence. Within minutes, the fragile, carefully maintained facade of the Bellevue mansion began to crack, then shatter. Morgan emerged from the master suite, her face a mask of furious, hysterical confusion. She was clutching her smartphone, her fingers clawing at the screen as she shouted into the receiver. She was not the poised socialite wife anymore. She was a woman cornered, her voice screeching through the hallway as she berated the lawyers on the other end of the line. She slammed her phone down onto the marble table and spun around, her eyes wide, darting toward the front door where Derek was still standing, his eyes fixed on the eviction notice in his hand. "You promised me this house was yours," she shrieked, her voice rising to a pitch that rattled the crystal chandelier in the foyer. "You told me the finances were solid, that the funding was guaranteed. Now there is an eviction notice 72 hours. Where are we supposed to go, Derek? I cannot live like this. I want a divorce. I want out of this pathetic, lying life." Derek did not look at her. He could not. He stood motionless, his entire frame sagging, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. The eviction notice was not just a legal document. It was a neon sign announcing his absolute failure to the entire neighborhood. His phone continued to buzz, a relentless, maddening pulse of incoming calls, each one undoubtedly representing another vicious creditor or an irate, cheated investor. The chaos grew more intense by the second. Morgan began tearing through the closets, frantically shoving her expensive designer collection into mismatched suitcases, her movements frantic and disjointed. She was no longer looking for luxury. She was looking for a way to salvage the only currency she understood, sobbing as she tossed silk dresses and leather boots into the luggage, screaming that she had been betrayed, that she was the real victim in this unfolding disaster. I started my descent down the grand staircase, my steps slow, deliberate, and entirely silent. By the time I reached the bottom step, the front door was open, and the morning light flooded in, illuminating the scene of their utter disintegration. But the eviction notice was only the beginning of their reckoning. Before Derek could even attempt to answer Morgan's litany of accusations, the low, steady rumble of an engine caught my ear. 2 marked squad cars pulled into the circular driveway, their tires crunching loudly on the manicured gravel. I watched from the safety of the foyer as 2 uniformed officers stepped out, their faces neutral and professional, their hands resting habitually near their holstered weapons. Mitchell had delivered more than just a real estate transaction. He had utilized the deep, irrefutable documentation we had gathered to file formal federal embezzlement charges against Derek. The evidence concerning the systematic draining of Leo's education trust fund was undeniable, a clear, white-collar crime that carried a mandatory prison sentence. One of the officers approached the front porch, pulling a pair of cold metallic handcuffs from his utility belt. Derek froze, his mouth hanging slightly open as the officer approached him, the silver metal glinting in the morning sun. The neighbors had begun to emerge from their houses, drawn by the commotion, staring as the man who claimed to own the neighborhood was suddenly publicly brought to his knees. Derek did not resist. He watched, completely paralyzed, as the officer seized his wrists, the harsh metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the driveway like a final permanent judgment. Morgan watched from the doorway, her hands flying to her mouth, her suitcase spilling open and scattering her expensive belongings across the porch. As Derek was pushed toward the back of the squad car, she lunged forward, not toward him, but toward me, her eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. She saw me standing there, perfectly composed, the silent witness to their entire undoing. "Robert, please," she choked out, her voice raspy and broken as she tried to grab my arm. "You have to tell them there was a mistake. I didn't know about the money. Derek did all of it. I'm innocent. I'm just his wife. I was kept in the dark. Please, you have to help us." I looked at her, my expression remaining completely still, a statue of absolute detached judgment. I did not move away from her touch, nor did I offer any comfort. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket with a slow, agonizing precision. I tapped a single button, and the high-fidelity speaker filled the porch with the crystal-clear damning audio from 2 nights ago. Her own voice rang out across the driveway, clear, sharp, and mocking, detailing the plan to drug me, to label me mentally incompetent, and to dump me in a state-run facility so she could finally be free to liquidate my entire life. The recording stopped. The only sound left on the porch was the distant wail of a police siren, a sound that seemed to be laughing at her. She stood there for a heartbeat, the reality of her own words finally carving a path through her denial. She stared at me, her mouth working silently, before her knees finally buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the gravel, her designer clothes ruined her face, buried in her hands, utterly and completely destroyed by the truth she had so carefully constructed for me. I turned my back on them both, walking toward the gate, as the doors of the squad car slammed shut, sealing the fate of the boy who thought he could outsmart his own father. The chaos of the eviction and the subsequent arrest of my son had left a vacuum of silence in my life that I had not experienced in years. It was a silence filled with the bitter taste of betrayal, but also the intoxicating sweetness of absolute hard-won victory. In the weeks that followed, the legal machinery moved with a cold and brutal efficiency. Mitchell was a whirlwind of professional precision, his team working tirelessly to secure every remaining asset. We presented the mountain of evidence, not just of Derek's gambling debts and the fraudulent medical schemes, but the explicit documentation detailing the systematic embezzlement from little Leo's trust fund. The judge did not hesitate. Given the overwhelming proof of criminal intent and the clear danger Derek and Morgan posed to the child, the court granted my petition for full emergency custody with no visitation rights. The weight of that decision felt like a physical burden lifting from my chest, replaced by the profound, grounding responsibility of protecting the only innocent life in this entire miserable saga. I moved Leo out of the reach of the toxic debris that had been his parents' lives. We traveled west, leaving the dark, echoing halls of the Bellevue mansion behind us. My destination was a secluded, serene cabin perched precariously on the rugged edge of Lake Tahoe. It was a place I had purchased decades ago, a sanctuary where I had once come to escape the relentless grinding pressures of the corporate world, though I had rarely visited it since my business ventures exploded into an obsession. Now it served a far more noble purpose. The morning air at the lake was impossibly crisp, carrying the sharp, clean scent of mountain pine and the refreshing metallic tang of cold, deep water. I sat on the weathered wooden dock, my worn boots dangling just above the surface, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of burnt orange and soft, bruised purple. My fishing rod rested gently on my lap, the line cutting a fine, shimmering path through the glass-like water. Beside me, Leo sat cross-legged on the planks, completely absorbed in a massive steaming plate of eggs and bacon that I had prepared in our rustic kitchen just an hour before. He was wearing an oversized flannel shirt that swallowed his small frame, his hair windswept and messy. For the first time since this nightmare began, the hollow, haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a bright, inquisitive spark. He laughed, a sudden melodic sound that seemed to dance across the stillness of the lake as a curious duck drifted nearby. He was safe. The toxic parasites who had sought to consume everything I had built were either rotting in a holding cell or desperately drowning in the legal and financial bankruptcy I had meticulously engineered for them. I looked out over the vast, expansive mirror of Lake Tahoe, watching the ripples from my line slowly expand toward the horizon. I thought about the man I had been when I first bought this cabin, a man who believed that if I simply provided enough, worked hard enough, and accumulated enough, I would naturally secure the loyalty and love of my descendants. I had provided, blindly pouring fortune after fortune into Derek's grasping hands, foolishly believing that material abundance could bridge the character gaps that his own entitlement had created. I realized now, with a clarity that stung, that I had failed to raise a son because I had prioritized the size of his inheritance over the quality of his spirit. I had given him the world without teaching him the value of the ground beneath his feet, but I would not make the same mistake twice. The ruthlessness I had been forced to summon to burn their world down was not a cruelty, but a necessary fire. Sometimes the greatest act of love is having the iron will to destroy everything that has become rotten, to clear away the suffocating weeds, so that the small, fragile things can finally breathe and grow. I was no longer the distracted, wealthy father who let others define his family's values. I was a man reborn, a guardian, who had learned that true protection requires the strength to act, the intelligence to plan, and the cold, unyielding resolve to see justice through to the very end. Leo nudged my arm, pointing excitedly at the end of the line as it began to twitch against the surface. His face was lit with the simple, uncomplicated joy of a child who was finally living, not just surviving. I leaned forward, my hand steady, feeling the pulse of the line in my fingers. I was home. I was finally truly present. The past had been liquidated, the debts had been collected, and the future was a clean, uncharted landscape. I cast my line back into the depths, watching the sunlight sparkle on the water, knowing that whatever challenges awaited, I had finally forged the strength to shield the ones who truly mattered from the shadows. The cabin stood silent and strong behind us, a monument to a new beginning, as the sun climbed higher, warming the world, and we simply sat there together in the perfect healing quiet of the morning.